Most people believe that childhood is just a phase of life that, once overcome, is left behind. A collection of memories, old photos, resolved or ignored traumas, and behaviors that maturity should erase. However, Carl Gustav Jung revealed a truth that radically contradicts this common notion. Within every adult lives a child. And it is not a symbolic memory or an emotional vestige of the past, but a real psychic entity, a living archetype that continues to operate silently in the adult mind, influencing thoughts, sabotaging decisions, distorting relationships, and shaping entire identities. This inner figure, which Jung called the archetypal child, is not passive. It is not asleep, waiting to be forgotten. On the contrary, it acts as a deep, often unconscious energetic force that carries both the purest qualities of being, such as creativity, sensitivity, and the capacity for wonder, as well as the oldest and deepest wounds: abandonment, rejection, humiliation, invalidation. Jung observed in his clinical practice that most adult suffering originates from the repression of this inner child. Instead of looking at it, caring for it, or integrating it, we learn to hide it. We wear masks of maturity, social roles, rationalizations, and vices to keep it locked away. And with that, we pay a high price: neuroses, existential crises, chronic anxiety, emotional codependency, feelings of emptiness, and an endless repetition of destructive patterns. The problem is that this child does not disappear just because it has been ignored. On the contrary, the more it is denied, the more it manifests in the shadows, in disguised and disorganized ways. Adult individuals who react with fury to minor criticisms, who feel invisible in relationships, who constantly seek validation from authority figures, or who cannot establish clear boundaries, are often not being immature in the pejorative sense of the term. They are simply being governed by the wounded child that has never been seen or understood. And here lies the most delicate and powerful point of Jung's thought. This child does not need to be healed as if it were a defect. It needs to be recognized. It needs a legitimate space within the adult psyche. For Jung, true psychological growth does not happen by denying the inner child, but by developing what he called the internal paternal ego, the ability to care for oneself from within, to establish an internal dialogue between the wounded part and the protective part. This is the beginning of true emotional maturity, not repressing pain, but listening to it, not pretending to be strong, but building solidity. This video is an invitation to revisit this forgotten part of your psyche. A deep dive into the idea that your inner child is not an obstacle to your adult life, but the key to unlocking your authenticity, creativity, and emotional freedom. Understanding this dynamic is not just a therapeutic exercise, it is an act of psychic survival in a world that increasingly demands disconnection from ourselves. And perhaps by looking into the eyes of the child we once were, and still are, we can finally understand why we are so tired, so lost, and so needy. The answer was never out there. It has always been within. And it was small, sensitive, and invisible, until now. For Carl Jung, archetypes are not abstract ideas or poetic metaphors. They are living psychic structures that inhabit the collective unconscious. They shape behaviors, perceptions, and emotions with a force that goes beyond logic or reason. Among these archetypes, few are as impactful as that of the inner child. What Jung identified was not a nostalgic memory of childhood, but an active psychological entity, a center of emotional energy that remains within the individual, regardless of chronological age. This inner child is not trapped in the past. It manifests in the present, in your reactions, your desires, your most irrational fears, and in the way you relate to the world and others. It is common for people to think of memories or episodes from childhood when we talk about the inner child. But Jung proposed something much deeper. The child is a symbol of the self in formation, representing both the beginning of the individuation journey and the potential for transformation that is yet to come. It is simultaneously vulnerable and sacred. Within it lies the essence of spontaneity, sensitivity, curiosity, and creativity, but also the deepest wounds, unprocessed traumas, and feelings of helplessness, shame, and abandonment. This inner presence subtly but devastatingly influences adult behavior. When ignored, the inner child manifests through attitudes that seem disproportionate. Emotional outbursts, irrational insecurities, fear of abandonment, constant need for approval, difficulty dealing with criticism or frustration. Many adults live their entire lives guided by this wounded child. Even if they hold leadership positions, have established families, or maintain a public image of success. The inner child does not respect status. It just wants to be heard. The archetype of the child also has an ambiguous character. It can be both a bridge to our healing and the source of our greatest imbalances. When it is integrated, we connect with creativity, intuition, and lightness. When it is repressed, we sabotage everything we try to build. For this reason, Jung saw this figure as one of the most important elements of the unconscious. He said that ignoring the inner child is like amputating a part of the soul, and that any attempt at personal or spiritual development that does not involve this reconnection is doomed to failure. However, not all inner children are the same. Jung observed that it manifests in different forms, with different needs and distortions. Some take control silently, others scream desperately for attention, but all influence. And to truly understand the impact this force has on our lives, we need to know its multiple faces, and that is exactly what we will explore in the next part. The three main manifestations of the inner child identified by Jung, and how each of them may be silently shaping your deepest patterns. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Carl Jung did not limit himself to identifying the presence of the inner child as a unique phenomenon. In his clinical studies, he realized that this archetype takes on multiple expressions within the adult, each with specific needs, strengths, and distortions. These expressions are not rigid categories, but patterns that interpenetrate, forming the invisible foundation of our behaviors. Understanding these faces is essential to recognize where the most automatic and painful reactions we have in adulthood come from. The first of these is the wounded child. It carries explicit and implicit traumas, abandonment, rejection, emotional neglect, physical or symbolic violence, chronic invalidation of feelings. It is this child that learned, often very early, that expressing needs was dangerous, that asking for attention was humiliating, and that trusting led to pain. When not integrated, the wounded child manifests in the adult as fear of intimacy, chronic anxiety, codependent relationship patterns, emotional hypervigilance, difficulty in trusting, and a persistent emptiness that no external achievement can fill. It is this child that makes us react to criticism as if it were existential attacks, feel rejection where there is none, and repeat cycles of self-abandonment. The second face is the eternal child, or puer aeternus. While the wounded child lives in the past, the eternal child lives in escape. It is that part of us that refuses to grow up, to take on responsibilities, to endure frustrations. It seeks constant novelty, immediate pleasure, effortless admiration, and has a visceral fear of limits or commitments. In the adult, this child may appear as chronic procrastination, unstable relationships, aversion to routines, difficulty in building something long-term, or a feeling that being an adult is a prison. Jung did not see this face as a moral defect, but as a sign that the vital energy of childhood had not found a mature place to express itself. The third is the divine child. It represents the deepest creative, spiritual, and intuitive potential of the human being. It is the part of us that still believes in the mystery of existence, that feels life as a sacred phenomenon full of possibilities. It is the source of our insight, our genuine compassion, and our capacity for wonder. But ironically, this child is often suffocated by the pain of the other two. Without space to emerge, it withdraws and becomes inaccessible, leaving the adult disconnected from their own creativity and sense of purpose. Jung believed that most people predominantly live under the dominion of the wounded child, reacting to the world from a state of emotional lack and survival. We seek in romantic partners the parents we never had, react to criticism as if it were personal rejections, and create patterns that unconsciously repeat our childhood stories. This dynamic is not a sign of weakness. It is the direct manifestation of a powerful archetype operating without awareness. Recognizing these three faces is not an intellectual exercise, it is a key to deep self-knowledge. When we can name which of these children is in charge at a given moment, we take the first step toward regaining control of our own psychic life. But to do this, we must first understand how, from an early age, we were taught to hide this inner child behind social roles and masks, a mechanism that seems to protect us, but actually makes us ill. And it is precisely about these masks of maturity and how they repress the inner child that we will talk about in the next part. From a very early age, we learn that certain emotions are unwelcome, that feeling too much is a sign of weakness, that crying is ugly, that depending on others is shameful, that being overly sensitive is a flaw. And then, as the years go by, this emotional education, marked by repression and symbolic punishment, teaches us to wear masks. Masks of strength, control, independence, maturity. We create a socially acceptable self, designed to please, to be functional, to avoid rejection. But this self is often an empty shell, built on the systematic denial of the child that still lives within us. Carl Jung observed that this suppression of the inner child, done under the guise of maturity, is one of the central causes of modern psychological suffering. Repression does not eliminate pain, it displaces it. What the conscious mind tries to ignore, the unconscious stores. Repressed anger turns into anxiety. Ignored need becomes compulsion. Stifled vulnerability emerges in the form of addiction, sabotage, psychosomatic illnesses. Instead of healing our wounds, we become experts at masking them. These masks take various forms. There is the mask of the responsible adult, who always takes care of others but never of themselves, often guided by an inner child who learned that they only deserve love when they are useful. There is the mask of the strong and invulnerable, who needs no one, who never cries, who solves everything alone, but whose inner child was forced to grow up too quickly. There is also the mask of the successful, who achieves, performs, impresses, but lives exhausted trying to prove their worth to parents who may have never truly seen them. These masks are unconscious attempts to ensure emotional safety in a world that punished our vulnerability. The problem is that these strategies distance us from who we really are. They create a gap between our authentic self and the self we show to the world. And the greater this distance grows, the more we feel the emptiness. An emptiness we try to fill with consumption, distraction, relationships that numb us, or even with superficial spirituality. But none of these things replace the psychic truth. The inner child does not disappear with time. It waits. It waits to be recognized, heard, embraced. And while that doesn't happen, it sabotages, not out of malice, but because it is the only language it knows to get our attention. Many adults spend decades in this cycle, ignoring the inner child in the name of maturity and reaping as a consequence a depleted emotional life, superficial relationships, and recurring existential crises. They believe they need to be stronger, more productive, more rational. When in fact, what is lacking is the opposite: sensitivity, listening, presence. There is a lack of someone within them capable of caring for the child that was never cared for. There is a lack of an internal figure of protection and nurturing. And it is precisely this figure that Jung called the internal paternal ego, the psychic instance that allows the adult to become, for themselves, the father or mother they never had. This is the true beginning of healing. And this is what we will talk about in the next part. If the inner child is a living and active force within us, how can we coexist with it without being dominated by its wounds? Carl Jung's answer is profound and, at the same time, surprisingly practical. It is not about repressing the child, but about developing within oneself an adult who knows how to care for it. Jung called this the internal paternal ego, a psychic instance that functions as internal parents, capable of embracing, protecting, and offering what the wounded child never received from the external world. Contrary to what many think, emotional maturity is not about abandoning the inner child, but about creating a relationship with it. And this requires something that few people have truly developed: conscious self-welcoming. The internal paternal ego is this ability to become an observer of oneself, to notice when the wounded child is in control and, instead of reacting impulsively or repressing it, to establish an internal dialogue. It is to say internally, "I see your pain. I am here. I will not abandon you." And this simple psychic stance has a revolutionary impact. Imagine an everyday situation. Someone rejects or criticizes you. You feel a disproportionate reaction: anger, deep sadness, or a sudden urge to withdraw and isolate yourself. Instead of simply reacting, the paternal ego comes into action. It recognizes that it is not the adult who is suffering, but the wounded child who is reliving in that moment an old pain of abandonment or invalidation. By doing this, you completely change the internal dynamic. You move from a reactive mode to an active self-care state. This process is the core of true psychological maturity. It is not about becoming cold, distant, or indifferent to emotions, as many confuse with being an adult. It is exactly the opposite. It is about developing a type of internal presence that knows how to contain pain without identifying with it. It is to be simultaneously the child who feels and the adult who cares. This integration is what transforms the fragmented psyche into a functional psyche. But this does not happen solely with rational awareness. The paternal ego needs to be cultivated. It requires practice, intention, and above all, commitment to emotional truth. Many try to heal childhood pain only through reading, meditation, or conventional therapy. All of this helps, but it does not replace the internal work of learning to care for oneself as a good parent would care for a sensitive child. And it is at this point that we enter the territory of reparenting, the process of offering the inner child what was never given to it. In the next part, we will explore exactly how to do this, not in theory, but in practice. What are the attitudes, internal stances, and behaviors that build a new type of bond with your wounded child? A bond that no longer depends on the external world, but is born from within. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Most people believe that time heals childhood wounds, that growing up, becoming independent, and gaining emotional autonomy are enough to overcome the past. But the truth is more brutal. Time does not heal anything that continues to be ignored. The wounds of the inner child remain open, not in the realm of memory, but in the body, in relationships, in automatic reactions, and in patterns that repeat from generation to generation. And that is why Jung proposed a radical, and profoundly transformative path: reparenting. To reparent oneself means to consciously become the adult you needed when you were a child. It is not about going back to the past, reliving traumas indefinitely, or getting lost in lamentations. It is about building in the present a real relationship with the most sensitive and wounded part of your psyche, and doing for it what your original caregivers, due to limitation, ignorance, or trauma, could not do. This includes offering emotional validation, internal safety, clear boundaries, and, above all, permission to exist as you are. This process begins with listening, deep listening. Not the intellectual listening that tries to understand pain with logic, but the emotional listening that embraces what arises without trying to correct it. The inner child does not want to be fixed. It wants to be recognized. It wants to know that its pain makes sense, that its fear is not madness, that its need for love was not excessive. The reparented adult is not the one who has become invulnerable, but the one who knows how to handle their own vulnerability without self-betrayal. Reparenting also involves establishing internal boundaries. Often, the inner child seeks in others what the conscious adult has not yet learned to offer. It seeks protection in dysfunctional relationships, validation in social media, love in bonds where it needs to diminish itself to be accepted. Learning to say no to these impulses is not rejecting it, but protecting it. It is like saying, "You no longer need to beg for love. I am here. I take care of you now." Another fundamental aspect of reparenting is the practice of emotional self-regulation. This means developing the ability to calm oneself, to offer presence in moments of crisis, to comfort oneself without resorting to compulsion or escape. These are simple yet powerful acts. Stopping to breathe when anxiety arises, writing to oneself as if consoling a real child, choosing to distance oneself from toxic environments even if it hurts. Each of these actions sends a silent but decisive message to the unconscious: I will not abandon you anymore. Over time, this process begins to change something very deep. The wounded child stops screaming because it is finally being heard. Impulsive reactions decrease because now there is an adult present in command. Relationships change because the emptiness no longer demands to be filled at any cost. The energy once trapped in defenses and repetitions begins to circulate freely, and with it, creativity, sensitivity, and a genuine desire to live return. This is the essence of true healing, not erasing the past, but creating a present where old pain finds acceptance. Reparenting oneself is, at its core, a revolutionary act. It is saying that the story does not end where it was interrupted, that there is a new possibility, not to rewrite what happened, but to radically change the way it lives within you today. But there is something even more powerful that happens when this inner child stops being carried as a burden and begins to be recognized as a guide. It transforms. And it is about this transformation that we will talk in the last part. Because when the inner child is heard and cared for, it reveals its true potential, not as a problem to be solved, but as the key to a new life. Something profound happens when, after years or decades, the inner child is finally heard. The pain that once manifested as chronic anxiety, emotional addictions, destructive relationships, and an insatiable void begins to slowly dissolve. And what emerges from this process is not just relief, it is power. Not an aggressive or performative power, but a silent strength that arises from reconnecting with parts of yourself that were exiled. When this child is no longer treated as a problem and is recognized as an essential aspect of your being, it stops acting in the shadows. It no longer needs to sabotage your life to get your attention. It doesn't need to scream inside you every time someone rejects, criticizes, or ignores you, because now it knows it is no longer alone. There is an adult there, a present, protective, available adult. An adult who has learned to love, not because it was taught, but because it chose not to repeat the abandonment. And at this point, something almost magical happens. Pain gives way to creativity. Lack makes room for real connection. Anxiety transforms into presence. When the inner child feels safe, it reveals its highest face, the divine child, the one who is not afraid to feel, to create, to explore, to be enchanted, the one who carries within it the deepest meaning of life. Jung said that the child is a symbol of wholeness, and when it is integrated, the human being stops living fragmented, divided between persona and shadow, between what is shown to the world and what suffers in silence. True freedom begins when you no longer need to fight against yourself, when you no longer need to wear masks to deserve love, nor shrink to be accepted, when you become the very home you have always sought in others. This is the turning point, and it does not come from outside. It does not come from courses, relationships, or empty promises. It comes from the radical gesture of looking inward with courage and saying, "I see you. I am here for you. I will not abandon you anymore." This is the beginning of a new life, a life that is more whole, more true, more light, a life in which you no longer need to survive. You can finally live. Now that you have come this far, I want to know, what was the moment in your life when you felt your inner child needed someone the most? Share in the comments. Your story can touch and inspire others who are also going through this process. And if this video spoke to you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel, because this is just the beginning. In the next video, we will continue to deepen this inner journey, and you need to watch, because it will be just as important as this one. Your transformation does not stop here. See you there.